Welcome back to the Dear Katie podcast. This is Katie Kessner. I am the primary host of the Dear Katie podcast, and we are so delighted to have you take this journey with us on our weekly podcast episodes. I just want to remind everyone to do great self-care. Thriving is part of the purpose of this podcast, and we definitely want you to take a break at any time. Warm bath, fresh air, walk a dog, have a bite of chocolate, whatever you need to do good care for yourself. Just as a reintroduction, if you're not familiar with me, I am the woman who was on the cover of Time magazine at age 18 as the first in history to speak out nationally and publicly as the victim of date rape. And HBO made a film about me, and I went on to become the executive director of the Take Back the Night Foundation. We are the oldest, largest global movement on sexual violence in all forms for all people in the world. So we encourage you to visit our website for lots more information. So I'm going to turn it over to our host and our guest for today.
Welcome to the Dear Katie podcast. This is Claire Kaplan.
And this is Emily Wang.
And we are lucky today to have a very interesting guest, Caitlin Avery, who's going to share her story with us. And welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Glad to have you. And we would like to start with, perhaps if you could share with us just a very, very, very brief little bio about yourself, and then we'll get into the whole purpose of your presence today.
Yeah, I am an author and I write in the field of women's fiction. I have one memoir additionally, but mostly women's fiction. And I guess the thing that has gotten me in the sort of the attention of the Me Too movement, et cetera, is that in 2015, I outed my high school rapist on Facebook and learned of 9 other victims in 24 hours. And that opened up a whole can of worms among alumni of my high school. And it sort of set me on this trajectory that I have been on ever since.
Wow, that's a lot in 3 sentences. So maybe you could start first by telling us the story, a sort of bare bones of your story.
The bare bones story of my assault?
Yes, the assault and what you would like to share with us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can give you as much information as you'd like. I don't hold back, and I'm not uncomfortable talking about it at all. So the gist of the story is that when I was 17 years old, the summer before my senior year of high school, I was assaulted at a party. It was by 2 different people. The assault occurred, I'm not exactly sure over the course of how many hours. Because the first one occurred while I was 100% completely unconscious. And the only memory I have of that situation is that I woke up for an instant in the middle of the situation, and then I basically blacked out again. Now, at that time, after the assault happened, I did know that I had only had fewer than 2 drinks at the party. And so I have no proof of this whatsoever, but I suspect that I may have been roofied. And there's all kinds of different reasons for that. But basically, so what happened was I was assaulted by somebody at a party, and it was outside, out in the grass, basically out behind the house. And when I came to and kind of pulled myself together and came back into the party, I was quite upset, as you can imagine. And I didn't really know what exactly had happened, but I knew what had happened was something that I had not been part of. Like, I wasn't partaking in it, and it had happened to me. And so anyway, I basically expressed to somebody that I was really upset and messed up. I felt like I was still very out of it at that time. And they told me to basically go upstairs and try to find some place to lie down. And I remember as I was walking up the stairs that there was a group of these guys hanging out at the top of the stairs, sort of snickering, or there was like a kind of they were like laughing at me as I walked up the stairs. And I went into an empty room and closed the door behind me to try to sit down and have a quiet space. And somebody came in the door after me and basically, came after me again, cornered me. And I, in this case, was awake and aware enough to fight both verbally and physically. And neither that didn't work. So I was assaulted again. And that basically led to the following week, I got phone calls from both of those guys, both of whom were in college at the time. So this was a statutory situation by both of them. I had never spoken to either one of them before the assault happened. I mean, literally within the minutes leading up to both assaults, I didn't speak to them. And both of them individually reached out to me. Both of them individually asked me out. And the one guy actually essentially apologized for his behavior that night. He didn't literally say the words, "I'm sorry," but he was full of remorse and expressing that. And he was actually, as I recall, he was crying a little bit on the phone. And it was almost as if he was trying to double back and tell me that he really was truly interested in me and he wanted to take me out and wanted to know if I was willing to go out with him. And obviously I said no and, hung up on him or whatever. And then the other guy called me and he was definitely not apologetic. He was a well-known athlete when he'd been in my high school. And he basically, asked me out in a more of a cavalier manner with obviously no regret whatsoever about what he had done. And in the year, and I said no and hung up on him as well and never spoke to either one of them again. And then in the years, like the few years after that incident, I learned about two other people from my high school who had supposedly been assaulted by the second guy, the one who was not apologetic. And it was him. He is the one who I actually decided to out on Facebook all those years later. The reason for that was because it was triggered by the Stanford rape case. When that whole thing went down and the guy got out of prison after like 3 months, it was like a slap on the wrist.
Mm-hmm.
I was absolutely livid, obviously, with that situation. And basically, in some ways it was spontaneous, but I just threw up like one paragraph on Facebook to say, like, I know you guys have heard about the Stanford rape case. I just want to let you know that the same thing essentially happened to me. And it happened by somebody that we all went to high school. Facebook, I was friends with a lot of people in high school. And I basically just used his initials. I did not use his full name because I was concerned about legality behind that. I was scared enough just to use his initials. But as I said at the opening, that within 24 hours, tons and tons of people had reached out to me, and I had learned of 9 other victims. And it was basically everyone guessed immediately who I was talking about because he was that kind of character. I heard from men and women, men reaching out to me saying that they had been bullied by him, both physically and verbally, back when we were in school. So overall, he was just a really bad guy. And the bottom line is I outed him because I knew already of 2 other victims. I chose not to out the other guy because I have no recollection really of what happened between me and the other guy. And like I said, he had sort of made an effort to show remorse about it.
Yeah.
And so it's a little complicated, but I have consistently gone after the more brazen of the 2 fellas for years. So.
Wow. What a tremendous act of courage, number one. And how did it feel to you when you heard from all these survivors?
It was complicated at that time. It was a lot to take in. So just to put it in context, it was about a year and a half before the Me Too movement happened. So I had never seen any other woman do this or heard about it. And so it was incredibly intense and scary. I thought that I was basically very afraid of getting in trouble with the law or him coming after me, even maybe physically, because I knew he lived in the area. So I was really scared, but I was extremely relieved, let's say, to hear from so many other victims and it was that final validation that what I thought it was is what it was. And in the meantime, I was validating all these other victims, many of whom had never actually been able to call it an assault. Back in those days, this was the 90s when these assaults happened. And there was sort of this attitude like, for young girls to not get caught with your pants down, right? Don't get yourself in trouble in situations at parties and stuff. So I think a lot of the women who had been assaulted by him had never even labeled it as a rape. I was actually able to do that pretty much right away. But it was just a lot of relief to know that I was sort of bringing some sort of peace to these women, to know that, they had indeed been attacked. It wasn't their fault what happened to them.
Wow. So
I'm,
go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, I just really want to, that's incredible that, these people felt so comfortable reaching out to you after you had sort of broken that ice initially. I do kind of want to backtrack to that sort of culture that existed at the time. And I guess if you could share a little bit about what the community conversation at the time was about, purity and sexual assault, as well as the conversations around education and being roofied and things like that.
So I got zero education at that time, aside from sex ed, where we learned a little bit about the birds and the bees. There was zero discussion in my school years about, consent and making sure that somebody is really interested in partaking in any kind of, sexual event. So there was no education. And what we were as high school girls, we understood that at parties, when people are drinking, you had to have a little bit more of a guard up. You had to watch your back. You just had to make sure that you were staying safe. That was kind of it was all on the women's shoulders, all on the young women's shoulders, to watch out for themselves and make sure that they didn't get taken advantage of, whatever that was supposed to mean. That is not what happened to me. Mine was, an aggravated assault. It's there was nothing in my story that had anything to do with date rape or anything. I didn't have any flirtations with these guys, nothing. So when the assault happened, the next day I did tell 3 people. I didn't tell any adults, and I did not tell the authorities, obviously, but I told my best friend, I told my boyfriend, and I told a coworker who was a young man. So I did inform people right away that this thing had happened, that I had been attacked. It wasn't my decision to have sex with these guys. And that was, there was a lot of drama around it. My boyfriend was obviously, initially, he was pretty upset that I had sex with 2 other guys, although that wasn't what it was. But, I had to kind of calm him down. And then I had to actually talk him out of going after them. So there was just a lot of bravado, machismo, where he was saying he wanted to go beat them up, or I want to kill those guys,
Right.
that kind of. And so there was a lot of fear about, I didn't want him to get in trouble. He's the one I cared about, right? I didn't care about the other guys, but I was really afraid that he was going to do something stupid and it would be my fault, in my 17-year-old brain. So there was just a ton of stress around it. I did feel like I had screwed up, and it mostly centered around, honestly, in my 17-year-old head, I was upset with myself for wearing short shorts. That's the one thing I remembered, that I had dressed in sexy shorts. And that was what I had regrets over for a long time. There was a ton of shame about it. And it was a mess. I mean, it was basically, my best friend got really mad at me because I had disappeared at the party, and she and I had gone to the party together. So there was all these misunderstandings the next day that I had to clear up. Yeah. And then, like I said, there was no consideration whatsoever whether or not I was going to call the police on him, because at that time, any time you ever heard about a woman accusing a man of rape, all you learned about was that the woman got put on the stand and they ripped her to shreds about what she was wearing, how many drinks she had had, et cetera, et cetera. And I, at the time, had never, you asked about roofies. I had never heard of roofies. And it did not even occur to me that I had potentially been roofied until many years later, maybe 10 years later, when I first started understanding that there was a date rape drug that would make you unconscious. I didn't know why I had wound up unconscious. I had no idea. I didn't understand what had happened to me, really. But I definitely didn't set out to get wasted at this party. I wasn't on some mission to get drunk or anything like that. I was having drinks like everybody else was. Yeah. So the only, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. That's okay, Caitlin. It leads to a couple of questions. One is, the scenario you're describing is so common, and as you mentioned, the Brock Turner case, the Stanford case, but also there was an infamous case more recently that was in a high school, and there's actually a documentary made about it. The young woman who was unconscious, and she was gang raped by a number of young men in high school, et cetera. And again, these were all football players, so they were highly valued young men, and she was not. and it's the same kind of scenario. But so common. And so your caution at the time makes complete sense, right? That you didn't know what people were going to do or say. And I'm also thinking about your boyfriend at the time and his, that sort of bravado, masculine, protective, but also it's about him, reaction. What did you say? You sort of somehow you managed to talk him out of it. What did you do to get him either A, to calm down, or B, to not do what he was inclined to do?
I basically just told him that I didn't want him to wind up in jail over this.
Yeah.
It didn't make sense to me for him to go out and then get arrested for whatever he was talking about doing. At that time, I really just wanted to sweep it under the rug for the most part. And remember, I didn't know of anybody else besides me at that time. And so, yeah, it wasn't until years later that I found out that the one guy, the one who I've gone after all these years, he was at Ohio State. He was home for the summer, but he was a student enrolled at Ohio State. And it was during that decade where Ohio State had a humongous problem with date rape drugs and rapes being reported on campus that were being swept under the rug by the university. It later came out and blew up and was a big issue for the university. But I didn't learn about that until many years later. And that's when I started thinking, oh, I wonder if he learned about date rape drugs and brought them home to use on high school girls when he came home.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because the people that I found out who were other victims were all either 1 year older than me, my age, or 1 year younger than me. And none of us were his age. He was older than all of us.
So I'm curious. You've been very public about this. You're talking about this guy. People figured out who it was. What has there been any backlash? Have you heard from him, or have friends of his contacted you?
I think that I am super blessed and my story is extremely unique in this sense, but I have never had any issue come up that was bad for me around this. There was no pushback whatsoever. In fact, I was hearing from not only people who were victims of him, people who had maybe seen things at parties that made them wonder if they had seen another victim like come out of a room. And then I also, believe it or not, heard from at least one of his best friends who was very apologetic for his behavior back then. He basically admitted that a lot of the stuff he was doing at that time was questionable. And, his friends were having real stress as they learned my story about what they should have done way back when about him. No one did anything about him. And it was indicated to me that this was not a surprise to anyone. And yeah, it was just something that we all kind of lived with. I don't know, like it's been amazing. The one thing that happened when I outed him on Facebook was there was a lot of discussions about things that could be done. There was a lot of talk about whether or not we could form a protest. I wasn't the one leading the charge here. People were reaching out to me saying, we want to do something. We want to make this known, make this public. And there was suggestions that we should have a protest outside of either his home in a neighboring town to mine or in downtown Boston where he worked. He was a very high-powered businessman at the time. And then word got out and somehow a news reporter heard about the story from someone and reached out to me to try to do an interview for the New England cable network. And so when those two things were proposed to me, I had to start acting very quickly. I had to figure out if I was actually putting myself at major risk for being sued. So I did consult with a lawyer. Somebody actually offered me free law advice. Again, it was somebody who I'd gone to high school with. They heard about the story. And that person had dealt in law that dealt with libel. So he educated me and said that basically I couldn't really get sued and get, found guilty for libel if the story was true. What I was saying was true, then I wasn't going to actually get in big trouble. But he did say that if I kept going after this guy, kept, jabbing at him, eventually he was going to have to respond. And it could be something like just in the form of a cease and desist letter from a lawyer, or, something else. But whatever it was, he said, if you keep going after him, you are going to pull him into your life. And you really need to think about whether or not you're prepared to do that. Like if you want to deal with that or not. And that's all he had to tell me. It's like all the hackles on my body stood up. I was like, no way. I have no interest whatsoever in having a conversation or anything with him. So yeah, I'm going to shut this down. And so I basically did that. It was over the course of about a week. I outed him, and then I came back on Facebook and said, well, now I've learned of 9 other victims. And then one of the victims decided to stand up beside me and say, this did happen to me. I'm ready to publicize my story. She wrote a blog and she published it. And so that just, was more validation for me, basically. But at the end of the week, what basically happened was I started getting scared that he was possibly going to show up like on my front stoop and maybe attack me or something. So I had a really bad panic attack that led me to the ER. I wound up in the ER. And after I got home from the hospital, I said, that's it. I'm done. I did what I came here to do. And I went one more time on Facebook and basically said, I basically want to shut this down now. Like I didn't intend to become the poster child for this. I just wanted to I wanted to validate other victims because I knew that there were a few others and it turned out there were many more. So I wanted to validate their experience. And I wanted to take my shame that I had for so many years and put it on my assailant, which I felt like I had achieved. And I wanted to warn the community about him. And I also managed to do that pretty well. So when that was all said and done, I said, you know what? I think the best revenge is the fact that I'm living a really good life. And I think I'm just going to go on and keep living my life. And that's the end of that. So I shut it down publicly, but behind the scenes for about 2 months after that, I was getting notices and messages from people all the time. And, in some cases, they were sort of informing me what was going on with him behind the scenes. One thing that I learned about was that he had been engaged. He was divorced, but he was also engaged to another woman. And apparently he was forced to tell his fiance what was coming out about him. And she ended the engagement and left him. So that was the one win. That was the one big win for women. I felt like that happened. But outside of that, he didn't have any sort of, punishment of any sort. There was nothing else that happened where he got like in legit trouble. The interesting thing is, though, that was in 2015. And so 9 years later, he has actually taken several turns for the worse and is not doing well at all right now. And when I was going after him last year, I was using the story as part of my marketing for my latest novel, because my novel is about a woman who goes after her rapist 20 years after the fact and manages to do everything I wish we could have done to ours. And so I used that to tell I basically was using my story to bring interest to my book. And while I was actually going after him on an almost daily basis online, I was told by a couple of different people behind the scenes that he had become suicidal. And so I actually took about 2 weeks off, and I did say, look, I am actually not trying to ruin this guy's life. I don't want him to kill himself. That's only going to punish the people who love him. It's not going to do anything to him. He'll be dead. And that would be a real disappointment to me, because I want him to live the rest of his life with the knowledge of what he's done, and just to feel like he never knows when I'm going to come back out of the woodwork and start talking about this. Because I talked about it in 2015, and then I came back in 2023 and started yapping about it again. And so to me, that was sort of like a life sentence, because he has no idea now if I'm going to do this all over again, start rattling his life. So
interesting. So you've written this book. What is the title of the book?
The book is called Life of Sin, but it's CYN because the main character's name is Cynthia.
Uh-huh. So I'm curious, what has, often we ask our guests who are survivors in the show, what has happened since, and what are you doing in terms of your healing process, et cetera. It sounds like your book was a big part of that. Can you tell us something about that? And the process of writing that book, too.
I'm sorry, you said, what was the second
process of writing it and how that was for you, given that was, your kind of your story.
Yes, absolutely. So there has been so many different stages of my healing, which started with the fact that I was able to talk about this in the days after it happened to me. So really what I like to tell people is my entire source of healing has been talk. It's just talking about it. I've talked so much about it and in such great detail that none of it disturbs me. I have no emotional response at all anymore to telling my story. And the first time I really got in depth with it was I wrote a memoir in 2002. And the memoir details the assault exactly. Like, it basically tells, in great detail what happened to me. And that was my first experience of putting it out there in for the public to see, to read, whatever. So that was sort of the first level of like just deciding to share my story, and with the intention of, I don't know, maybe not just helping myself, but making it a little bit more regular for women to do so. One thing that I'm trying to do these days is to end the secretive nature of sex assault. So just by talking about it online, I'm hoping to inspire others to maybe be able to get it off their own chest if they're keeping secrets about an assault that happened to them. But yeah, talk has really been the key. I've had a therapist at various times in my life, so I have talked about it to my therapist. But writing my memoir and then writing the novel gave me a way to change the story to make it something that was really successful. So the ending to my story has there's no great end, right? He's still out there living his life. But I rewrote my story essentially to cover all the things that I wish that we could do now, all these years later, to him, which is mostly, in the legal sense. But the bottom line is that in the story, I wanted to explore the idea that what would happen for me if he had indeed, wound up in jail, or if I had gotten some sort of restitution for the crime. I don't believe anymore that necessarily would have healed me at all. I don't think that would have contributed any more to my healing. I actually needed to work on my own self and fix the maladies that had happened for me as a result of the assault in order to live a good life. It's kind of irrelevant, actually, in the end, what happens to him. So the story of my novel the theme is learning how to clean up your own side of the street when it comes to conflict and trauma. Because that has been the root of healing. And when I was writing the book, I wanted to sort of explore what it would mean for her to forgive him. Now, I didn't feel at that time like I had forgiven my assailant at all. So I did a little bit of research to even see what that means. Like, what does it mean to forgive someone? And the best definition that I came across was that forgiveness can just mean letting go of anger. And that really resonated for me. It just seemed like something that I could wrap my mind around. And yeah, I can understand how letting go of anger would be really good for me. So lo and behold, in learning about that, just hearing about that made it possible for me to say, yeah, I can own that. I do feel like I have forgiven him in that sense. I'm not angry about it anymore. And I don't have any ill will towards him. I think it's important to let people know who might cross paths with him what his history is, because I have to assume that he still has the potential to be a rapist. But outside of that, I'm not hoping for him to have a miserable life. It seems as though that may be happening just, by happenstance, but
it's self-inflicted.
Yeah.
Essentially. Yeah. It's such an interesting idea that letting go of anger is a form of forgiveness. And I'm sure that's making a lot of our listeners contemplate that whole notion, because so often people will tell survivors, especially if it's in a context of someone or it's something within the family or within a community, about how you have to forgive someone, and which is awfully premature when there's been no justice or even any kind of opportunity to process in a productive way. So, but this is such an interesting idea. Emily, you must have questions.
Yeah, actually, I guess over the past 20, 30 years, in what ways have you seen this sort of narrative and conversation around sexual assault shift, which I'm sure you've, of course, as a survivor, you are a little bit more aware of it, have your ear to the ground kind of thing. What's changed? What hasn't? And, where can we go from here?
Well, consent, just the term consent. Like I said, I'd never heard of that concept when I was a kid, when I was a teenager. And it has definitely been presented to my son since he was fairly young. I have one child, he's about to be 16. And so consent is something that I and my husband both taught him very early on. And I actually have kind of an interesting story about, it takes a village to raise a child. So when he was in 5th grade, I was taking him and some friends it was his birthday party. And we were in the car on the way to where we were headed. And he was getting ready to finish 5th grade. And his friends were egging him on that he should try and kiss some girl that he had a crush on before 5th grade ended, because they were going to be going on to different schools after that. So it was like his last chance to get a kiss from this girl. But what happened was, I think there were 5 boys in total, and it pretty quickly escalated into this idea that they were saying, you could just chase her down on the playground, grab her and kiss her. Like, don't be a chicken, you can do it. Rah, rah, siskumbah. And I basically couldn't help myself, obviously with my history. I said, whoa, 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 whoa. That is not how you kiss a girl. You are not allowed to kiss anyone if you don't ask first. And here's how you ask. It's very simple. You just say, can I kiss you? If you want to hold her hand, can I hold your hand? Can I take you out on a date? All these things are not complicated to do, but it might feel a little awkward, a little nerve-wracking to say that. And guess what? If you are not old enough or mature enough to say those words, you are definitely not old enough yet to participate in the act that you guys are talking about. So, make sure that you ask. And I just remember the whole car was like, whoa, like I came on kind of strong. And I have no regrets about that. I'm very proud that I did that, even though it was kind of spontaneous in the moment. I didn't know exactly what I was saying, but I just got it out and said, this is not okay, you guys. So like I said, consent has been taught in my household for a very long time. And I do know that they are being taught that in sex ed courses or like sexual health class in high school. So that's great. I think that a lot of the problem around assault is still something that needs a lot of change. And that is just that like men are still sort of valued higher than women in the world. And that is one of the root reasons as to why girls are afraid to speak up when something like this happens, because they're afraid to ruin the guy's life, right? Nobody wants to like put this criminal behavior on a boy who has all these things going for him, and he's going to make something out of his life. And, he needs to be able to have a good job and earn a good living so he can support a nice family and stuff. Meanwhile, women, like, you just need to get over it. You need to carry your rape whistle and make sure you don't wear earphones when you're running. So those things definitely have not changed enough, in my opinion. But what I'm basically trying to say now is that forget the rape prevention techniques. We got to tell boys and men that no matter what it is, they need to ask first. If they're, if you're just starting to get together with somebody or it's your first time with somebody, all you need to do is get a yes. And people say, oh, that's like awkward to have to actually use your words. But I'll tell you what's awkward. 20 years of trauma. That's really awkward. And I'm over it. I finally got over it, but I'm not willing for other women to go through that. I would rather have a moment of embarrassment in the world of young people where they have to actually say, do you want to XYZ, whatever, and get a firm, yes, I would like that. Because here's the thing, when it comes to that, men and women and teenage boys and girls are not going to stop having sex just because we have to talk about it. We'll figure it out. We'll figure out a workaround. Eventually people will get real comfortable with talking about it if that's the only way to do it. So
bravo to you. Yes, I'm 100% with you on that point. And what's interesting, I mean, if you talk to, and I've been doing education in higher ed for many, many years, but if you talk to people about, they say, you don't talk about sex, for example, or asking ruins the mood. I said, talk to any woman and say, what is it that you like? And you say it in a kind of low voice. They're going to say like, you got me. There are plenty of ways to communicate verbally about these things in a way that's a complete turn on. And it's why we teach young people that this is not okay. I don't understand. Yeah. There's nothing in life that you would be doing without having some communication around it. So, and this is such an important thing. So good for you for talking with those boys. I bet you really left an impression on them.
I hope so. I mean, I remember it very thoroughly, and I'm sure my son does too. You know, he didn't, but he certainly didn't act embarrassed. I think he just knows that I'm an outspoken. I've always been kind of an outspoken kind of person, so he probably was just like, "Oh, another day, another dollar." That's my mom.
Yeah, right. That's right. That's great. Emily, do you have any other questions for Kaylin?
Ooh, I guess like I think I kind of want to backtrack to a little bit of like your healing process, and what that was like for you. Especially, I think a lot of our listeners are in a place where they're healing, because healing is a very long and it's a very continual journey. So what for you were some of the most important things, in that healing journey? What are some of the moments that you remember most? And was there ever a point where you were like, wow, like this is it, like I'm doing so much better, I feel so much better? Did you ever have a moment like that?
I suppose that moment came during the Me Too movement, where I was not the one talking at that point, but I started to understand that all the talking I had been doing had a point. Like, this is what we really needed. We really needed to be able to say, this happened to me. And if we speak out about it and say it readily and comfortably, then it might actually make people, men who are interested in assaulting other women, think twice about it. Because if it becomes something that women aren't scared to say happened, then it might actually make men be more scared to do it. So I guess Me Too was this really interesting period of time for me, where I had mixed feelings about it, quite frankly, because I was super proud of all the women who were putting themselves out there and telling their stories. But I was also really frustrated that for every one of those women, there was a rapist out there who was not paying for his crime. Like, no one was actually getting in trouble because of the Me Too movement. I mean, there were some huge names that were getting in trouble, but let's face it, like Cosby, they had to have like 100 victims to really put together a case against him, So I'd say that the other thing that was like really important for me to understand was, in those early years, let's say the first 10 or 15 years after my assault, when I would share with another woman, for instance, about what had happened to me, and then so often I would hear from them that something similar had happened to them. And that just made me feel that I was not alone, that it was not weird that had happened to me, that it's actually really common. And it just made me realize it wasn't my fault. And then I also would take the extra step I had to tell, sort of when I was still dating, and I was intimate with somebody, I often had to tell that person first what I had gone through, because I was still in the stage where I would occasionally have a flashback or a weird reaction in bed, when I was in bed with somebody. And I just wanted to put it out there and make sure that they knew ahead of time that it wasn't them, it's me, and it's just part of my history. And each time I shared with a guy, like, they were so sorry for their, the rest of men, like that they were sorry that men were like that. And I don't know, I got a lot of support from men as well. As I have continued to get in the last year, I've been contacted by so many people, but men and women reaching out and just saying that they're so, happy is not the right word, but they like the fact that I'm doing what I'm doing, because they think it's really important. They think it's really important for their own children to grow up in a society that is a little bit more open about this stuff, in the hopes that it will be, prevented in the future more. But yeah, I think, as I always say, like, it's just talk and talk and talk and talk about it has helped me so much. And talk is free. I know it's not easy, but all it requires is that you have one person who you can, share with and trust and open up to start that process. So I think that it's pretty accessible for most people. Again, it's not easy. I'm not suggesting that it's easy. But even just the concept of like writing it down on paper, getting the story down for your own private eyes, but on paper, and then maybe like burning the pages up or something like that, just to not keep it inside. Because for me, keeping it inside was just going to rot me. Like it had to come out. I needed to actually share the story, for, I don't know, for my own sanity, I guess.
I think that you mentioned two things. One is the process of talking and speaking aloud your experience, which is so important. And secondly, the process of writing, both of which, for people who are, for example, therapists or people who work on these issues, both of those two methods are highly effective for survivors. And you have taken it even a step further in writing a book, that two books really, but about sort of around this topic. Do you find that writing is generally a cathartic process for you?
Well, I couldn't live without writing. I've been a writer since I was old enough to write, and I'm not exaggerating. I actually set out to write my first book when I was 6. It's kind of like a joke, but I literally did. So I have been writing. I wrote poetry when I was a teenager to, get all this mixed up stuff in my head down on paper. It was just a way to like get it down organized on paper, and then I could kind of shut the book on it, so to speak. I could take my crazy thoughts and close the notebook and put it away. And so I've always found it to be incredibly cathartic. But I am kind of hooked on writing. Like I write all the time, on a daily basis. So I'm not sure if that's true for everyone, but it has been for me.
I'm a writer too. I don't write as much as I should, but I totally get what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You don't, you write it down, and like you said, you could burn it up if you wanted to. You could keep it privately. Looking back at my, teenage poetry, I don't know what it is about teens and poetry, and the angst, is a way of getting it out. But it's an important process, and it helps it does help your brain go through things in a way and analyze and look at things again. And for our listeners who hadn't thought about doing that, just takes a little, take some paper or a computer or whatever, however you want to do it, and just start writing things down. It can be quite a wonderful experience to do that. Is there any other, do you have any other suggestions for our listeners in terms of, from your experience, what you found to be helpful, or maybe particular moments for you that really were sort of life-changing?
I guess one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that I found it very helpful in my 20s to become very physically capable. And what I mean by that is that I actually studied kickboxing when I was younger. And I've always been a major athlete, and I took on kickboxing as a way to sort of be able to, like, take my angst and beat it into a bag or whatever, kick the bag or whatever. But I also found that in learning how to kickbox, it made me extremely confident when I was walking around town. And there was one instance when I was a waitress in Los Angeles when I was, I don't know, probably 25. I should have asked somebody to walk me to my car, and that's my regret. I should have done that, but I didn't. And I got out after midnight and was walking down an empty street and very dark at night. And there was somebody across the street. It was a pretty big boulevard, but across the street, there was a man walking the opposing direction. And as I passed him, I saw in my peripheral vision that he jogged across the street and wound up behind me. And he immediately came up behind me, and he was talking really fast. And I don't know if he was on drugs. I don't know what his deal was, but he was like, "How you doing? It's a beautiful night," like blah, blah. And I didn't even think. I turned around and stood square to him, and I screamed at the top of my lungs, "I am not in the effing mood." I screamed it as loud as I could.
Awesome.
And he ran so fast away from me. I was like, whoa, I didn't know I had that in me. But it basically, I don't know if that came from the fact that I was becoming very physically capable as a woman to hit somebody. Like, I was ready to stand in front of him because I knew that I could throw down if I needed to. And I took that attitude and I just vocalized it, and it worked. So I don't know. I thought, eventually I didn't keep up with the kickboxing. But that seemed to also bring some sort of like a level of courage for me so that I could be out in the world as a woman and not be so concerned if guys were hanging out the truck and, whooping at me or whatever. Like that used to really bother me. You know, it come across as a threat. It seems like a little thing, but when I was in my 20s and I was still the kind of look that guys were always interested in, whatever. I'm obviously 50 something now, so that doesn't happen anymore. But I just think that that would really rattle me when guys would be like whooping at me on the street, strangers driving by or whatever. I would get like all my hair would stand up on my body. So that's kind of why I started kickboxing. I just wanted to feel like more capable as a woman. I'm quite a petite person, so that helped me.
That's a great endorsement for becoming stronger, physically stronger, but also even just self-defense, basic self-defense classes. I mean, it's interesting. You didn't kickbox with this guy. You used your voice, right? You stood strong and used your voice. That's all you did. And he ran in the other direction. I think people don't understand what an impact it can have when a woman stands up for herself in that way. And it does not take very much, does it? You don't have to be a super powerful person.
Yeah. I'm glad it turned out that way. It's not like it felt good in the moment. I was very scared.
No, of course not.
I got back to my car and I was mad at myself that I didn't have somebody walk me to my car. I definitely saw my mistakes, but looking back on it, I was like, okay, that worked. And that is something that I can rely on in the future if I need to. So.
Right. And you knew in the back of your mind, you had the sort of some of the skills to back up what you were saying. And that's important too.
Yeah.
So, well, good. That's awesome. Good for you. I love that story. That is a great story. Great story. So, Emily, do you have any last questions for Caitlin? It's been awesome.
Yeah, I guess not a question, but I do want to say, like, I definitely agree with this. Like, once you become stronger, such that like you are not afraid to defend yourself. Just even that sort of confidence, I think keeps a lot of people from fucking with you. Pardon the French, but it keeps a lot of people from messing with you. And so, of course, I just really want to emphasize that for our listeners and really share in that like feeling like, oh, I am not afraid to hit somebody to defend myself. I am not afraid to throw down if I need to defend myself. That kind of confidence really helps you sort of not feel afraid to say no. And even that the word no itself is just so powerful. A strong no really, really does like go miles. So I guess now that we're sort of wrapping up, reaching the end here, do you have any sort of final pieces of wisdom, final thoughts for our listeners, whether they be survivors or supporters?
I don't really have any final thoughts. I mean, I would, encourage anybody who might be a reader out there to check out my book, Life of Sin, because even though the beginning of the story sort of smells like a revenge tale, that is not the grand message at the end. Sort of the life lesson in the book is to learn how to clean up your own side of the street. And basically the idea is that you can't go around hurting other people with your own malfunctions, whatever they might be, just because somebody hurt you, right? So I had to get straight. I had to fix some things in my own self, one of which is I had to get sober. So I actually got sober a year after my assault happened at the age of 18. And that's just one of the sort of things that I've done throughout the years to try to work on myself. But yeah, I basically needed to stop trying to numb out and run away from this thing that had happened to me and just own it and lean into it instead of trying to become numb to it. If anybody's interested, they can check out my book.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we could put a link to your book on our website too, if anyone is interested. So I'll be happy to do that. Well, Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a wonderful conversation. I think it'll give some information to folks to feel good about, which is really nice to hear that and to end that note of defiance and resistance. So thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. It's been my honor.
Okay. And Emily, you want to wind us up?
Yes. I guess thank you to all of our listeners, our wonderful, wonderful listeners and supporters for joining us as well today. Thank you, of course, to Caitlin here for sharing her story and all of her awesome wisdom, as well as sort of speaking out and really breaking the ice in her own way. For all of our listeners, you can find out more about our resources and more about everyone on the podcast, as well as ways you can support us on our website, as well as takebackthenight.org. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again, everybody, for joining another episode of the Dear Katie podcast. I hope very much you found today's episode helpful, empowering, and a way to take another step in that long journey toward healing and supporting those we care about, learning about sexual violence prevention, and also survivor support. For those of you who don't know, again, the Take Back the Night website has tons of great resources, books, self-care options, cool merch. If you're feeling like you need a wearable, we have great t-shirts. Of course, we would love it if you follow along on our free newsletter with news and events going on around the country and even around the globe. And finally, don't forget to like us and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. You'll find our entire community popping up here and there, and recaps of our podcast episodes as well. So together we shatter the silence, and together we end the violence. Take care.